If you're a fan of One Piece and Jujutsu Kaisen, then you've probably noticed this difference. On paper, Jujutsu Kaisen looks like it has the better fights. A while ago, I put out a tweet asking what JJK does better than One Piece, and while a lot of people pretended like One Piece is perfect, a lot of other people point out things like choreography and stakes. What it all really boiled down to were fights. In general, if you read the new chapters of Jujutsu Kaisen and One Piece, you probably like the fights in Jujutsu Kaisen better. Now, obviously, this is a matter of preference, so there's no objective right answer, but considering so many people feel this way, there's obviously a reason for it. As a matter of fact, I have 5 ways Jujutsu Kaisen does fights better than One Piece. To start off the list, something I'm surprised more people didn't shout out right away actually is paneling. One Piece is known for many things. Great characters, great fights, and a great art style. And while part of that great art style are things like character designs, backgrounds, and coloring, paneling is not one of those things. To be fair, this was never really a problem for hundreds of chapters. But once you get to Alabasta, you see some small reminders that the whole One Piece paneling problem isn't new. This is an ongoing issue that's been present in the manga for almost 1,000 chapters. Now granted, you can see similarly messy styles of paneling in other older manga. For example, when I was rereading JoJo's, I noticed some goofy looking pages like this one. But at least in a series like JoJo's, the pros outweigh the cons. Like, pages like that are fairly infrequent. With One Piece, you can make a small fortune betting that whenever there's a big arc or like a sequence of big fights, the paneling will suddenly look like trash. So then imagine you're a longtime One Piece fan and Jujutsu Kaisen comes around, and my god is the paneling a breath of fresh air. The paneling in Jujutsu Kaisen only gets better for me the more I read other battle series, and realize just how many of them rely on boring cut and paste styles of paneling. I mean, there's a reason people know what you're talking about as soon as you utter the words JJK paneling. Like, you could pick out any fight in Jujutsu Kaisen and it'll probably have better paneling than your favorite fight in One Piece. Granted, if you were to say pick one panel from One Piece and one panel from Jujutsu Kaisen, I'm sure you could do more than a few examples where One Piece looks better. But the truth of the matter is that Akutami can take a huge arc and seamlessly show each fight taking place across time. And then you go back to like Paramount War and it's like, so for starters, Jujutsu Kaisen fights usually seem better because they do in fact look better. And another big part of that is the choreography. But before I get into that, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread this video to other viewers like you. Now, the second part of this list goes hand in hand with paneling. And like I said, it's choreography. And while you can do a 30-minute deep dive on the topic, it really just comes down to one simple thing. Akutami takes the time to focus on each individual fight, whereas at least lately, One Piece will either mush them all together or rush right through a fight. In the case of Jujutsu Kaisen, even seemingly unimportant fights can look cool because Akutami takes the time to draw each step of the fight. So like, the fight will start with a clash, and then the next panel is a punch, and then a kick, then a turn, then a block, then an exchange, then this, then that, then this. So in this sense, Akutami is a lot more cinematic in his approach to fights. By comparison, One Piece fights seem like they cut out those parts. Like, when you read a One Piece fight, more often than not, you get all the clashes and big attacks, but you don't get the small in-between steps that are staples of every fight. It'd be like if you were watching UFC. Jujutsu Kaisen would be the full fight with all the dancing and sidestepping and 10 minutes of each fighter just playing mind games. And One Piece would be the highlights with none of the build-up to those moments. So, like paneling, the choreography also makes Jujutsu Kaisen fights look better because of the time spent making those fights look like real fights. And speaking of time, I'd like to get into the issue of pacing. But before I do that, I'd like to mention something I didn't really see anyone talk about. And this might actually be a bit of a hot take, I don't know. But another thing I think Jujutsu Kaisen does a better job of is power scaling. Now, this is a huge point of contention within each respective manga. For example, there are people who think JJK does a shitty job of power scaling, and obviously there's people who think One Piece power scaling is pretty wacky. I mostly bring this up so it's at least part of the discussion. I don't even know which one I would say has the better power system or who does the better job of power scaling. My guess is that most people would probably say Jujutsu Kaisen, and for good reason. While I love the system of devil fruits, I think we can all agree that had it not been for Haki, the power scaling in One Piece would be pretty unbalanced. Plus, I just don't think Oda cares about it like Akutami does. Akutami obviously has fun with the abilities, but I think they put a lot more thought into how those abilities work in practice, especially against other cursed sorcerers. It's not quite Hunter x Hunter levels of sophisticated, but it is up there with Hunter x Hunter and JoJo's. Again, I don't really have a good answer in this area, but it's something to think about considering most people would probably say JJK anyway. Now, like I said, pacing is another reason people like Jujutsu Kaisen's fights better, and with this one I think it's pretty obvious. It's actually funny because I mentioned how Akutami spends more time on fights, but in reality, most Jujutsu Kaisen fights are probably shorter than One Piece fights. Like, I think the longest was Gojo versus Sukuna, and that was like 20 chapters? Let me just look that up, and okay, no, it wasn't even 15 chapters. Okay, now how long was, let's say, Luffy versus Doflamingo, Luffy versus Kaido? Even if they're not that much longer in actual chapters, the time between when fights like those start and when they end can be brutal. And it's because of what I said earlier. Oda will mush a bunch of fights together so that you're jumping between like 5 different fights at once. Whereas Akutami will be like, okay, so remember Yuta? Yeah, so now he's fighting 2 brand new characters you know nothing about, and while this is happening, it's going to be the best fight you've ever seen. And that whole clash was only like 5 chapters, I think. And yet somehow Akutami does this thing where it feels like we spend more time looking at the fight, and yet it takes up way less time. We get focus on the fight, but it never drags on. Meanwhile, One Piece will drag a fight out for way too long to the point where even when you're reading the manga at your own pace instead of weekly, it makes you just want to skip to the end sometimes. Now, I'm not saying this is true for all the fights. There's a lot of cool fights in One Piece that are pretty well paced. But even fights like Luffy versus Lucci get obscured by literally everything else going on to the point where a fight that should only be like 7 chapters turns into like a 15 to 20 chapter fight. So for that reason, a lot of people, probably most people, feel that Jujutsu Kaisen handles its fights better. And on top of that, on top of power scaling, choreography, and paneling, I think where Jujutsu Kaisen has the advantage is in what you commonly see referred to as stakes. I guarantee that if I did a poll and asked who does stakes better, One Piece or Jujutsu Kaisen, most people would say Jujutsu Kaisen. And this can be for a bunch of reasons. Now, I won't lie, it's not like Jujutsu Kaisen has 0 ass pulls. Everyone has at least 1 or 2 moments where they were like, alright, well that's just stupid. But for every one of those, there's like 5 in One Piece. And the overwhelming example is the rule of P. Namely that anytime a character with a P in their name is seemingly killed off, odds are they're probably gonna come back. It happened to Pell, it happened to Pedro, and it happened to Pound. And there's a bunch of other examples like those. Meanwhile, in Jujutsu Kaisen, it doesn't happen all the time, but you do have more than a few cases where characters we cared about died. For example, you have the emotional and honestly traumatizing death of Junpei in early JJK. Later on, we get the shocking death of you-know-who in Gojo's flashback. After that, we got the heartbreaking death of Nanami, and right after that, we got the gruesome death of Nobara. Now, let's be honest. Do you care about every single one of those characters? Maybe not. I'm sure a lot of people didn't care about Nobara dying even if it was intense. In fact, some people are still waiting for her to be like, haha, just kidding. Regardless whether you care about those characters or not, everyone agrees that those deaths are intense and they impact the rest of the story in meaningful ways. Something that can only be said for a fraction of deaths in One Piece, which has a big impact. In One Piece, you're almost conditioned to assume that no one will ever die, so it almost doesn't matter who wins or loses. In Jujutsu Kaisen, characters can and often do die at any given moment. They're also just taken more seriously. I mean, Oda has come right out and said he likes when fights used to be goofy like back in the old days. So while he can make intense emotional fights, obviously Akutami takes them more seriously. So for this reason and more, I have to say that Jujutsu Kaisen generally has better fights than One Piece. Because of the paneling and choreography, they simply look better. Because of the power scaling and stakes, you can take them a bit more seriously. And because of the pacing, you get them in an easily accessible way. Are they always better written than One Piece's fights? No. In fact, I would even argue that Oda does a better job of writing his fights. But all the writing in the world can't change the fact that Jujutsu Kaisen has some of the best looking fights in all of manga. But now I'd like to hear what you think. How would you compare Jujutsu Kaisen and One Piece? Was there something I missed? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, then check out my video on Jujutsu Kaisen's art style. In that video, I analyzed Jujutsu Kaisen's artistic evolution. You can find that video in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.